In a quiet little neighborhood on the edge of town, there lived a man who thought he had it all figured out. His home was cozy, a ranch-style house surrounded by open fields and tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene, and exactly what he'd always dreamed of. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and for this man, trouble came in the form of something surprisingly small. His mailbox. It all started innocently enough. The old mailbox at the end of his driveway had seen better days, rusty, dented, and leaning precariously to one side. He figured it was time for an upgrade, so he went to the hardware store, picked out a shiny new one, and installed it with care. Following the rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, he made sure it was 6 feet from the curb, painted white, and only labeled with his house number. Everything was perfect, or so he thought. Not long after the new mailbox went up, strange things began happening. One morning, as he sipped his coffee and glanced out the window, he noticed something odd. His beautiful new mailbox was lying on its side in the grass, completely mangled. At first, he assumed it must have been hit by a car or maybe even vandalized by kids. But when he asked around, no one seemed to know anything about it. Shrugging it off as bad luck, he replaced the mailbox without making a fuss, but then it happened again and again. Each time, the same thing: a perfectly good mailbox reduced to scrap metal within weeks. Frustrated but determined not to let it get to him, he kept replacing it, hoping the problem would just go away. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Neighbors started whispering behind closed doors, hinting that the culprits might not be random drivers or rowdy teenagers. Some suggested it could be the HOA cops, those self-appointed enforcers who patrolled the streets in their golf carts, handing out fines for everything from overgrown lawns to holiday decorations left up too late. At first, the idea sounded absurd. Why would anyone intentionally destroy someone else's property? But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd heard stories about how strict the HOA could be, nitpicking every little detail and punishing residents who didn't fall in line. Maybe they were trying to send him a message. After all, he had accidentally left his trash cans out a day too long once, and his grass had been slightly longer than the allowed 3 inches during a particularly busy week. Could this really be their twisted way of getting back at him? The final straw came one sunny afternoon when he returned home from work to find yet another demolished mailbox. This time, though, there was something different. A neighbor walking. Her dog stopped to chat and mentioned she'd seen a golf cart speeding away from his driveway earlier that day. She didn't want to point fingers, but the implication was clear. That was the moment he decided he'd had enough. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about standing up for himself against what felt like bullying disguised as authority. Late that night, sitting in his garage surrounded by tools and scraps of metal, he began plotting his revenge, not violent or malicious, but clever. If these so-called enforcers wanted to play games, he was going to give them a challenge they'd never forget. Little did they know, their days of running over mailboxes were numbered. What he came up with next would change everything for him, for the HOA, and for the entire neighborhood. This expanded version keeps the tone conversational and engaging while building suspense and relatability. The focus is on storytelling rather than technical details, ensuring the audience stays hooked. Let me know if you'd like me to expand other parts similarly. The night after discovering the truth about his mailbox mishaps, the man sat in his garage, staring at the pile of tools and materials scattered across the workbench. His mind raced with ideas, each one crazier than the last. He knew he couldn't just keep replacing the same flimsy mailboxes over and over again. It was time to get creative. But how do you outsmart people who seem to think they're untouchable? That's when it hit him. If they wanted to destroy his mailbox, He'd give them one they'd never forget. He started sketching out a plan on a piece of scrap paper, jotting down notes and measurements as the idea took shape in his head. This wasn't going to be any ordinary mailbox. It had to look normal from the outside, after all. The HOA had rules about everything, and he didn't want to give them another excuse to come after him. But beneath its innocent exterior, it would be a fortress. Something strong enough to withstand anything those golf carts could throw at it. Over the next few days, he poured his heart into the project. Early mornings and late nights became the norm as he worked tirelessly in his garage. The first step was choosing the right materials. Ordinary wood and plastic wouldn't cut it this time. He needed something tougher. Steel beams formed the skeleton of the mailbox, while thick sheets of reinforced metal made up the walls. To hold it all together, he used industrial-grade bolts and hinges that wouldn't budge, no matter how hard someone tried to knock it down. For good measure, he filled the base with concrete, anchoring it firmly into the ground. If anyone thought they could push this thing over, they were in for a rude awakening. But the man didn't stop there. Knowing the HOA enforcers prided themselves on catching rule breakers, he decided to add a little surprise: a hidden camera. Tucked discreetly inside the mailbox, it was motion-activated and designed to record whenever someone approached. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it did the job perfectly. Every movement, every action near the mailbox would be captured in crystal-clear detail. He tested it multiple times, making sure it worked exactly as intended before finally installing it. As the final touches came together, the man stepped back to admire his handiwork. On the surface, the mailbox looked completely ordinary white paint, clean lines and a simple house number etched onto the front. It blended seamlessly with the other mailboxes lining the street. But underneath, it was anything but ordinary. This was more than just a mailbox. It was a statement. A way of saying, you can try to mess with me, but I'm not backing down. When the big day arrived, he carefully mounted the new mailbox at the edge of his driveway, double-checking that it met all the HOA guidelines. From a distance, it looked like any other mailbox in the neighborhood. Up close, though, it radiated strength and resilience. Neighbors driving by slowed down to take a closer look, some even stopping to compliment him on the craftsmanship. "Looks sturdy," one neighbor remarked with a chuckle. "Hope it lasts longer than the last one." Little did they know what lay beneath the surface, or the showdown that was about to unfold. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the man sat on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee and waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The familiar hum of a golf cart engine broke the silence, growing louder as it approached his driveway. Peering through the shadows, he watched as two figures in matching uniforms pulled up to his mailbox. They glanced around nervously, then exchanged smirks before revving the engine. It was showtime. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, not just in his neighborhood, but far beyond. The collision sent sparks flying, leaving the golf cart crumpled and the enforcers stunned. Meanwhile, the mailbox stood tall, unscathed and defiant. And thanks to the hidden camera, the entire scene was recorded frame by frame. As the man reviewed the footage later that night, a satisfied grin spread across his face. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a lesson for anyone who thought they could pick on the little guy without consequences. This expanded version keeps the tone conversational and engaging, focusing on the emotions and motivations of the protagonist. By detailing the process of building the mailbox and adding suspenseful elements, it ensures the audience remains hooked. Let me know if you'd like to continue expanding other parts. The moment of truth arrived sooner than expected. The man had barely finished installing his reinforced masterpiece when the sound of a golf cart's engine broke the evening calm. Sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, He watched us too. Figures in matching uniforms cruised down the street, their cart glowing under the dim light of the street lamp. They slowed as they approached his driveway, and even from a distance he could see the smug expressions on their faces. It was clear they weren't here for a friendly chat. He leaned back in his chair, pretending to be engrossed in his coffee, but his eyes never left the scene unfolding in front of him. A golf cart stopped just short of the mailbox, and the two enforcers exchanged a look that screamed mischief. One of them revved the engine, and without hesitation, they charged straight at the mailbox. The impact was deafening. Metal screeched against metal, sparks flew into the air, and the cart lurched violently, throwing both occupants off balance. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Then, as the dust settled, the unbelievable reality sank in. The mailbox hadn't budged an inch. Not a scratch marred its pristine surface. The golf cart, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Its hood was crumpled, and the front bumper hung loosely, evidence of the force it had met head-on. The two enforcers stared at the mailbox in stunned silence, their earlier bravado replaced by sheer disbelief. They climbed out of the cart, inspecting the damage like kids caught red-handed in the cookie jar. One of them kicked the mailbox experimentally, only to yelp in pain and hop around clutching his foot. The man couldn't help but chuckle quietly. From his porch. He'd built this thing to withstand anything, and now it was proving its worth in spectacular fashion. Meanwhile, inside the mailbox, the hidden camera was doing its job. Every movement, every reaction was being captured in vivid detail. The man knew he had struck gold. This footage would be his ace in the hole, undeniable proof of the HOA's antics. As the enforcers huddled together, muttering nervously about what to do next, he slipped back inside his house to check the recording. Sure enough, the camera had captured everything, the collision, the aftermath, and the unmistakable logos on the side of the golf cart linking it directly to the HOA. But instead of confronting them right away, he decided to play it cool. Let them stew in their embarrassment for a while. After all, they'd spent weeks, maybe months, bullying him over trivial things like lawn length and trash can placement. Now, it was his turn to hold the upper hand. He made multiple copies of the footage, storing them in different places to ensure they couldn't be destroyed or erased. If the HOA thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were about to learn otherwise. Word of the indestructible mailbox spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began stopping by to take a closer look. Some came out of curiosity, others out of admiration. "Did you really build this yourself?" one woman asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the mailbox. Another neighbor whistled approvingly and said, "If I ever need something unbreakable, I'm coming to you." The man simply smiled and nodded, letting them draw their own conclusions about what had happened. Not everyone was thrilled, though. A few residents whispered warnings, cautioning him not to push his luck. "You don't know what you're dealing with," one older gentleman said gravely. "These people don't back down easily." The man appreciated the concern but wasn't deterred. He'd already been pushed too far, and now he was ready to fight back not with anger or aggression, but with facts and evidence. As the days passed, tension simmered beneath the surface. The HOA enforcers avoided his driveway like the plague, casting wary glances at the mailbox whenever they drove by. But the man knew this was only the beginning. Sooner or later, they'd retaliate, and when they did, he wanted to be prepared. He reached out to a lawyer specializing in property disputes, sharing the footage and explaining the situation. Together, they drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board, politely but firmly demanding answers. When the response finally came, it was exactly what he'd expected, a formal complaint accusing him of violating community standards. Apparently, His excessive mailbox was deemed too large and heavy, despite meeting every guideline outlined in the HOA handbook. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here they were, accusing him of breaking rules while conveniently ignoring their own reckless behavior. Instead of backing down, the man doubled down. With his lawyer's guidance, he gathered signed statements from neighbors who had witnessed similar incidents involving the HOA's enforcement tactics. He also collected copies of past complaints filed against the association, painting a picture of systemic abuse and intimidation. Armed with this arsenal of evidence, he prepared to take the fight public, knowing full well it might get ugly. But he didn't care. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's iron grip. Late one night, as he sat in his garage reviewing the case file, he allowed himself a small smile. What started as a simple act of defiance had grown into something much bigger. Whether it ended in victory or defeat, one thing was certain: he had changed the game. And no matter what happened next, the HOA would never look at a mailbox or a homeowner same way again. The battle between the man and the HOA was about to reach its boiling point. Armed with evidence, determination, and a growing sense of justice, he decided it was time to take things up a notch. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone in the neighborhood who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's overreach. The indestructible mailbox had become more than just a symbol. It was now a rallying cry. When the official letter from the HOA arrived accusing him of violating community standards, he knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted to paint him as the problem, hoping he'd cave under pressure and remove the mailbox. But instead of crumbling, he used their own tactics against them. With his lawyer by his side, he sent back a carefully crafted response, complete with copies of the video footage showing the golf cart collision. The message was clear: you can accuse me all you want, but I have proof of your actions. To make matters worse for the HOA, the man didn't stop there. He called a special meeting of the Homeowners Association, an event that rarely happened unless someone was being fined or reprimanded. Word spread quickly among the neighbors, and soon the small community center where the meetings were held was packed with residents curious to see how the showdown would play out. Some came to support him, while others simply wanted to witness the drama unfold. On the night of the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. People whispered nervously as the HOA board members filed into the room, their usual air of authority replaced by visible unease. When the man stood up to speak, the room fell silent. Without saying a word, he connected his laptop to the projector and began playing the footage of the golf cart crashing into his mailbox. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the screen showed the unmistakable logos on the side of the cart and the faces of the two enforcers behind the wheel dot as the video played. The man calmly narrated what everyone was seeing. "This is my mailbox," he said, pointing to the screen. "And these are the people who keep running it over. Not kids, not random drivers, your very own HOA enforcement officers." His voice remained steady, but there was no mistaking the edge of anger beneath the surface. "They've done this multiple times, without apology or explanation. And when I finally decided to protect my property, they accused me of breaking the rules." The room erupted into murmurs. Neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For years, many of them had suspected the HOA of bullying tactics, but no one had dared to challenge them so publicly. Now here was proof staring them right in the face. One woman raised her hand timidly and asked, "Why would they do something like this? What did you do to deserve it?" The man hesitated before answering. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure. Maybe it was because he'd left his trash cans out a day too long or let his grass grow an inch past the allowed limit. Or maybe it was something deeper, a power struggle disguised as rule enforcement. Whatever the reason, he knew it wasn't fair. "I don't know why they singled me out," he admitted, "but I do know that nobody deserves to be treated this way. If we let them get away with it now, who's next?" His words struck a nerve. Slowly, other residents began speaking up, sharing their own stories of frustration with the HOA. A young couple talked about how they'd been fined for hanging wind chimes outside their home, even though they were barely visible from the street. An elderly man recounted how he'd been threatened with legal action for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning what started as a personal conflict into a full-blown rebellion. The HOA board members tried to defend themselves, insisting that their actions were necessary to maintain order and uphold property values. But their arguments sounded hollow compared to the raw emotion pouring out from the crowd. One board member attempted to shift the blame, claiming the golf cart incident was an isolated accident caused by reckless driving. Another suggested that a man had provoked them by installing such a confrontational mailbox. Their excuses only made things worse, drawing more criticism and laughter from the audience. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the tide had turned. The HOA's once unshakable grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and the man's bold move had inspired others to stand up for themselves. As people filed out of the room, several residents approached him to thank him for having the courage to fight back. "You're doing this for all of us," one woman said, patting him on the shoulder. "Don't give up." Despite the groundswell of support, the HOA wasn't ready to admit defeat. Days later, he received another letter, this time threatening legal action if he didn't remove the mailbox immediately. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, but the man saw it for what it truly was: fear. They were scared because they knew they were losing. Instead of backing down, he doubled down, filing a formal complaint with local authorities and reaching out to local news outlets. If the HOA wanted to drag this into the public eye, he was more than willing to oblige. Media coverage that followed was explosive. Reporters flocked to the neighborhood, eager to hear both sides of the story. Cameras captured shots of the infamous mailbox, which had become a local landmark overnight. Neighbors lined up to share their grievances, painting a picture of an organization that prioritized control over community. Meanwhile, the HOA board members found themselves on the defensive, struggling to explain their actions without sounding tyrannical. As the story gained traction, pressure mounted on the HOA to make changes. Facing mounting criticism from residents, regulators, and the public, the board members had no choice but to resign one by one. In their place, a new group of leaders emerged, people who genuinely cared about improving the neighborhood rather than micromanaging it. Rules were relaxed, fines were reduced, and communication between residents and the association improved dramatically. For the man at the center of it all, the victory was bittersweet. He hadn't set out to become a neighborhood hero or spark a revolution. All he'd wanted was to protect his property and live in peace. But sometimes, life pushes you into roles you never expected to play. And as he stood in his driveway, looking at the mailbox that had started it all, he couldn't help but feel proud. Proud of himself for standing up to bullies, proud of his neighbors for finding their voices, and proud of the fact that together they had made their community a better place. The fallout from the mailbox saga rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What started as a personal battle between one man and his HOA had turned into a movement that inspired an entire neighborhood and even people in other communities to stand up against unfairness. The indestructible mailbox, once just a quirky project born out of frustration, became a symbol of resilience and defiance. It wasn't just about protecting property anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity. As the story spread through local news outlets, social media, and word of mouth, the man found himself at the center of unexpected attention. Reporters knocked on his door, asking for interviews. Strangers stopped by to take pictures of the now famous Mailbox. Some came to congratulate him, while others sought advice on how to deal with their own overbearing HOAs. At first, he felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but soon he realized it was an opportunity to share his experience and encourage others to speak up when something didn't feel right. One day, a woman from a neighboring town drove over an hour just to meet him. She explained how her own HOA had fined her repeatedly for minor infractions, making her life miserable. "I didn't think anyone would listen," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "But seeing what you did gave me hope." Her story reminded him why he had fought so hard in the first place, not just for himself, but for everyone who felt powerless. The HOA board members' resignations marked the beginning of real change in the community. A new leadership team stepped in, promising transparency and fairness. They held open forums where residents could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Old rules were revisited and many were scrapped altogether. For the first time in years, people felt like they actually belonged in their own neighborhood. Flowers bloomed in yards, wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, and laughter echoed through the streets again. But the man's mailbox remained the star of the show. Visitors passing by couldn't resist stopping to admire it. Kids loved climbing onto its sturdy base, with permission, of course, pretending it was a spaceship or a castle. Neighbors joked about turning it into a community landmark, complete with a plaque commemorating its role in the Great HOA Rebellion. Even delivery drivers left notes saying things like, "Best mailbox ever." Despite all the praise, the man never let it go to his head. He knew the real victory wasn't the mailbox itself, it was the shift in mindset it represented. People had learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean shouting the loudest or fighting the dirtiest. Sometimes, it's about finding creative ways to expose the truth and refusing to back down when others try to silence you. His mailbox had done exactly that. It had stood firm, both literally and figuratively, against forces trying to knock it down. Years later, the neighborhood looked completely different. Gone were the days of tense confrontations and whispered complaints about the HOA. Instead, there was a sense of unity and pride. Annual block parties brought everyone together, and committees formed to tackle shared goals like planting trees or organizing charity drives. The man often found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that first demolished mailbox. It was amazing how one small act of defiance could spark such a transformation. On quiet evenings, he'd sit on his porch, watching children play near the mailbox. Parents would point it out to their kids, telling them the story of how it had become a legend. "That's the mailbox that took down the HOA," they'd say with a laugh. And every time he heard those words, he smiled. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, "Enough." Looking back, the man realized he had gained more than just peace of mind. He had discovered strength he didn't know. He had forged friendships he wouldn't trade for anything, and helped create a community where people felt valued. Sure, there were still disagreements and occasional squabbles. After all, no neighborhood is perfect, but they were handled with respect and understanding rather than threats and intimidation. The legacy of the mailbox lived on long after the headlines faded. Other neighborhoods facing similar struggles reached out for guidance, inspired by the idea that ordinary people could make extraordinary changes. Some even built their own versions of the indestructible mailbox, not necessarily to fight their HOAs, but as a tribute to the spirit of standing up for what's right. For the man, though, life returned to a quieter rhythm. He continued tinkering in his garage, working on projects big and small. Occasionally, he'd glance at the mailbox and chuckle, remembering the chaos it had caused. But mostly, he was grateful for the lessons he'd learned, the connections he'd made, and the knowledge that even the smallest acts of resistance can lead to something bigger than ourselves. In the end, the story of the indestructible mailbox wasn't just about winning a battle against bullies. It was about hope, courage, and the power of community. It proved that when people come together, they can overcome almost anything, even something as seemingly insignificant as a mailbox. And as long as that mailbox stood tall at the edge of his driveway, it would serve as a testament to the fact that sometimes the little guy wins not through brute force, but through ingenuity, determination, and a whole lot of heart.